For the most part, no. Most of the books that you find in the Bible are set in one time period and are connected to traditions that have them written in that time period, such as the Torah. This would be the first 5 books of the Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And there's a tradition going back over 2,000 years that says that Moses wrote those books. However, nowhere in the story does it say that Moses is the author of anything. And furthermore, in those books, Genesis takes place centuries before Moses is even said to be born, and Deuteronomy includes material that takes place after Moses died. So he'd have a difficult time writing things that happened centuries before his existence or, months after his existence. But again, it never even says that he wrote them. These are just traditions that were later attached to those books. Your books of the Bible are pretty much all anonymous. The only ones that we might be able to connect to any real people would be the epistles in the New Testament, 7 of which are considered to be authentic letters of Paul. But there's even been some doubt cast on that, and some scholars claim that they may actually be products of a later time. And some scholars think that Paul might not have actually even existed. But assuming that the 7 letters of Paul are actually written by Paul, they would be the exception, not the rule. Your 4 canonical Gospels are all anonymous, and they don't actually say when they were written. They're all written sometime after the events they portray, but we're not sure exactly when. They don't claim to even be historic documents, nor do they claim to be eyewitness accounts. They're all written as pieces of literature with a very structured plot, and none of them have dates connected to them at all. You also have epistles connected with Paul that were written sometime after Paul's death, assuming Paul actually wrote the first 7 epistles and actually existed. But if you go back to the Old Testament, things get actually a little bit more murky. So the Torah, the first 5 books, which some scribes used to say came from Moses, they contain countless anachronisms that show they are a product of a much later time. One major one can be seen in the very first chapter. This is the 6-day creation story. This story, in which God creates the world in 6 days, is based on a Babylonian creation epic called the Enuma Elish, which the Jews came in contact with during the Babylonian exile of the 6th century BC. Another anachronism comes when you read about Abraham. Abraham, it says, is born in the city of Ur of the Chaldees. Now we know when the Chaldeans were on the scene in the city of Ur, and that also was in the 6th century BC. So a man who was supposedly born in the 18th century BC is said to have been born in a city in the 6th century BC. So obviously there's a problem with that, about a 1200-year problem, or more, since it didn't have to be written during that time. It could have easily have been written after. There are other anachronisms just within the book of Genesis. For instance, they talk about domesticated camels, which they didn't have. Now, when you move on through the Torah, they begin talking about border disputes in the Promised Land. This is another anachronism, as the people didn't live in the Promised Land yet, according to the story. They wouldn't do that until the events of Joshua. And these border disputes seem to actually point to a much later time anyway, as they're talking about lands and different territories that these people wouldn't be discussing until closer to the 4th century BC or later. Now, the Old Testament pretty much is written entirely from the point of view of the southern kingdom of Judah. Everything is Jerusalem-centric. Jerusalem is the centerpiece of the Promised Land. It's where their main temple is. It's where their divine king sits, beginning with Saul and continuing on through David and Solomon and so on. But that's a problem, because until the 6th century BC, when the Persians took over, Jerusalem and the southern kingdom of Judah were kind of just small backwaters of the Middle East. The northern kingdom had been much larger, much more powerful, a greater population, higher technology, and a larger military. They wouldn't have cared what the kingdom of Judah to the south thought or did. And these were two completely separate nations. They were not unified. That wouldn't happen again until much later. So even the idea of a unified kingdom is an anachronism. But it's a far larger anachronism than those others, because Jerusalem wasn't the center and Judah wasn't the ruler of the kingdom, and they didn't have a unified kingdom or a central king until the time of John Hyrcanus in the mid-2nd century BC. So the idea of Jerusalem being the capital of the entire Promised Land is only a couple hundred years older than Christianity itself. So that means that the entirety of your Old Testament is one giant anachronism. And there are scholars now that actually believe that the Old Testament, as it is seen today, didn't really come into existence until around the time they were creating these stories, or at least translating these stories into Greek to create the Septuagint, which happened at the end of the 3rd century and beginning of the 2nd century BC. Another thing that points to this is in the story of Samson in the book of Judges. He destroys the temple of Ashdod, devoted to Dagon. And this temple to Dagon, it fell, I believe, in 167 BC. And so we have another 2nd century detail that is mentioned in the Old Testament. This destruction of Dagon is also mentioned in the first book of Samuel. So the entire Old Testament has a problem with its dating. It's not until you get near the end of the Old Testament, especially if you look at the Catholic Bible that has books like 1st and 2nd Maccabees, that you see anything that may have been written around the time it claims, which also would be the 2nd century BC. So we don't know exactly when these different books were written, but with the exception of the letters of Paul, which seem to be mid-1st century AD, everything else seems to have been written later. And going back to the New Testament, the Gospels are all based on the Gospel of Mark. Matthew copies Mark, Luke refutes Matthew, and John is aware of Luke but kind of does his own thing. But it all goes back to Mark. And Mark talks about the destruction of the Jerusalem temple, which happened in the year 70 AD. Now, Matthew might also include a scene that was borrowed from one of the works of Josephus that wouldn't be published until closer to 80 AD. So our Gospels had to have been written sometime after 70. But no one seems to know anything about them until the early 2nd century, around 115 to 125 AD, when I believe Papias first begins to quote and reference the Gospel of Mark. So our Gospels may not have actually been written until around 115 to 125, but they could have been as early as 70 or 75 AD, with Matthew coming about a decade later, Luke following a decade after that, and John a decade or two later. So, in short, no, none of the books seem to have been written when they claim, because the only ones that might have been as early as they seem would be the epistles of Paul, and those don't even have any dates that they claim to be written in.